Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Village Centenary by Miss Reed. You may recall last time Miss Reed was an unwilling witness to the shenanigans attending her cleaning lady's daughter and her erring, straying husband, who had left home in a rage because the daughter, too, is erring and straying. But the cleaning lady put that to rights, as we shall learn. Chapter 10, October. Oddly enough, I heard more about the clashing of the monsters from Amy when she visited me a few days later. Her window cleaner lives next door to Mrs. Fowler in Caxley, and he evidently gave her a lively description of the scene. He and his wife went upstairs to get a better view from the bedroom window, Amy told me. And whatever Mrs. P. may say to the contrary, her language was quite as lurid as Mrs. Fowler's. He said their money was on Mrs. Pringle right from the start. She's got the motive and the spirit and the weight, was how he put it. Very neatly put, too. They must have made an unholy noise. It's a wonder the neighbors didn't call the police. They were enjoying it so much I don't think they wanted to break it up. According to him, it was pretty plain that Ern was getting fed up at Mrs. Fowler's anyway. She used to expect him to do all the odd jobs around the house when he got back from Springbourne, and the food was rather sparse, I gather. I can well believe that. Mrs. Fowler had the reputation of being the stingiest woman in Fairacre when she lived here. So it looks as though Ern was ripe for the picking, and Mrs. P. plucked him at the right moment. Well, heaven bless the old harridan, I said. Now we've seen the last of Minnie and her brood. For the time, anyway, Amy said. I've no doubt they'll turn up in your life again before long. Heaven forbid. Tell me, how's the dismemberment of the book going? Amy looked quite animated. I've sent 2 short episodes to Woman's Hour, and they've taken 1. I'm going to broadcast it probably early next year. Marvelous. We'll have it on the school in the afternoon. Tell me more. Well, I'm writing an account of our sick room at school. That sounds somewhat morbid. Not really. It's supposed to be rather funny. You've no idea how dreadfully depressing that place was. It's doing me good to write it out of my system. What was wrong with it? Everything. For one thing, it was a symphony in green of all colors. Very restful, they say. Not when you're bilious, as most of the inmates were. And the greens didn't harmonize to make it worse, and the only decoration was a past pupil's lettering exercise in the most excruciating calligraphy, quite impossible to read from one's sickbed, but it was evidently that passage from Chaucer about the poor scholar who had 20 books clad in black and red. What with the writing and the spelling, one could feel one's mind giving way. You should have closed your eyes. Even so, you were assailed by the most nauseating smell of something the mistress who had attended you burnt on an enamel plate on the floor. It was called Persian tape, if I remember rightly, and if you weren't sick when you arrived, you pretty soon were once the Persian tape got going. Were you allowed visitors? Only the odd relative. Anyway, this ghastly place was at the very top of a high building, and most people jibbed at all the stairs. Patients were always in a state of collapse when they finally arrived, with their knees like jelly. Well, I hope you can do justice to it, I said. It sounds as though you have plenty of material. It should do something for my suppressed emotions, anyway, said Amy with evident satisfaction. Now tell me your news. How's the Centenary program going? I'm having Linda and Patrick over here after school tomorrow to try them out with their lines. Miss Clare, bless her, needs no rehearsing, nor Mrs. Austin, and Mr. Lamb from the post office has promised to tell us something about the famous trip to Wembley in the 1920s. It's not going to be such a formidable job as I first thought, and Miss Briggs is being unusually helpful with the singing. Do you think she'll stay? I'm beginning to hope so. She's much more cheerful since she found that young man, and she's gradually forgetting a lot of the highfalutin rubbish she was stuffed with at college, thank heaven. Well, good luck with it all, said Amy, collecting her things. By the way, James and I are having a short break in Wales next week to make up for his missing Tresco in the summer, so I shan't see you for a time. Do you know, I thought I might go again next summer to Tresco. I loved it so much. Then book up early, advised Amy. We're going again, but in May, when you'll be hard at work, of course, and we've already staked our claim. It seems rather soon, I said, to book for August. You do it now, replied Amy sternly. What a terrible procrastinator you are. I wonder anything ever gets done in this establishment. Now mind, sit down and write to that hotel this evening. Yes, Amy, I said meekly. I had written the simplest possible dialogue for Linda as Miss Richards and for Patrick as the bad boy John Pratt, but even so they seemed to find it difficult to memorize. Don't worry if it's not exactly the same, I implored them. As long as you get the meaning across, that's all that matters. If anything, this confused them even more. We had a break, and I produced lemonade and biscuits. Tibby entered and received a great deal of admiration from the two, and then we resumed. After 2 or 3 attempts, things went more smoothly. Linda seemed to be less self-conscious than Patrick, and with practice I thought the little scenes should go well. We'll try it with the other children one day this week, I'd promised them, and by that time you'll know your lines so well it will be much easier to concentrate on the movements. They looked doubtful, and I must confess that if these 2 comparatively bright pupils made such heavy weather of their parts, it did not look too hopeful for the rest of my cast. Again, I felt thankful that most of the performances would be in the more capable hands of 3 or more adults. They departed, clutching their 2-page scripts with them, their young brows furrowed with anxiety. Perhaps I was expecting too much from them, I thought, as I waved them goodbye. Fairacre children are shy by nature, and perhaps the idea of displaying their modest talents in front of parents, and even worse, their schoolfellows, was going to prove too much for their nerves. We could only wait and see. As so often happens in October, the weather was balmy, the skies cloudless, and that clear light peculiar to a fine autumn bathed Fairacre in end-of-summer beauty. The hedges were bright with glossy berries, the trees were beginning to blaze in all shades of yellow, bronze, and crimson, and the cottage gardens, so far untouched by frost, were still gay with asters, Michaelmas daisies, chrysanthemums, and dahlias. I relish these sparkling autumn days, all the more keenly because one knows that there cannot be many of them before waking one morning to a hoary scene and knowing that winter has arrived. I took the children out for plenty of exhilarating walks on the downs, and after tea each day walked again on my own before the sun set. By 6 o'clock it was beginning to grow chilly, and I enjoyed lighting a fire and congratulating myself on having the best of both worlds while the fine spell lasted. On one of my solitary walks through a little copse in the foot of the downs, I came across Miriam Quinn, who was enjoying the fresh air as much as I was, to judge by her pink cheeks and bright eyes. We walked along together in great content. "This is the breath of life to me," she said, after the office. "I look forward to it all day. Caxley's all very well for working, but I simply couldn't go back there to live after Fairacre." "You're not proposing to, are you?" I asked. She looked thoughtful, bending down to remove a briar which had caught in her skirt. "No, I'm staying, and I hope I'm doing the right thing. You know the young Mauns are taking over." I said that Joan had told me. "Well, I still have slight doubts about whether they truly want me living under the same roof. They've been terribly kind and pressed me to stay, and as I honestly can't find a thing worth considering elsewhere, I have agreed. In any case, I love it here, as you know, and it would be a dreadful wrench to have to leave. I'm sure they really do want you to stay. Henry Maughan was relieved to know you would be there when David was away on his business trips. I remember him saying how comforting it would be for Irene to have company in the house at night." "Really?" Miriam sounded pleased, but slightly incredulous. "I hadn't thought of that. I must say it's nice to be useful. I have already offered to sit with young Simon in the holidays if they want to go out in the evening. Irene seemed pleased about that, which delighted me. It would help them enormously, I'm sure." We walked along in silence for a short time until we emerged into one of Mr. Roberts' fields and turned toward the village. Miriam seemed to be turning over my remarks in her mind. "You know," she said at last, "one of the difficulties of being single is that there is no one to discuss these little problems with. It's so easy to see just one's own point of view. I'm glad you told me about Henry Maughan's comment. Of course, he's quite right. I'm afraid I've been far too self-centered over this business, anxious not to intrude, anxious about finding somewhere else, in fact, thoroughly steamed up and not really thinking of Irene and David's side of the problem. That must be one of the bonuses of married life, I imagine, being able to share one's troubles." "Except that you've got two people's troubles then," I pointed out. "Think how relatively uncomplicated our spinsterhood is." Marian stopped in her tracks and laughed aloud. It was good to see her usually pensive expression replaced by joyous animation. She ought to laugh more often, I thought. "Perhaps you're right. Anyway, I'm glad we met in the wood. I'm going home in a much more cheerful state of mind. What about coming back to Holly Lodge for a drink?" "I'd love to," I said, and we stepped out briskly together. The vicar called into school one glorious sunny afternoon, and we enthused about the weather. He is as devoted to the sun as I am, and when the rest of the villagers are collapsing with heat, he and I gloat together on perfect conditions for sun worshippers. He bore a jar of his own honey and presented it to me with considerable pride. I thanked him sincerely and inquired after the bees. "They've really done splendidly. I collected about 60 pounds of honey. It's so rewarding to see it pouring out of the extractor in a beautiful golden stream. To think that those dear bees have made thousands and thousands of trips all through the summer to collect the delicious stuff from all our beautiful Fairacre flowers." Obviously, our vicar was enraptured. "Are they all still about?" "Indeed, as busy as ever. I think they're collecting from the bramble flowers and willow herb now. I don't propose to take any more. What they fetch in now will help them through the winter." "Is there much for you to do to prepare them for the cold weather?" "A great deal," he said earnestly. "They will need some sugar syrup, and I intend to put up the mouse guards at the entrances. They creep in, you know, for shelter and possibly the honey. Quite alarming for the bees. I shall certainly take steps to protect them from marauders." He took a slip of paper from his pocket and consulted it. "A quarter of mushrooms, half of tomatoes, a dozen large eggs. No, that isn't it." He turned over the paper. Here we are, on the back of my wife's shopping list, you see. "First of all, how is the new window?" "So far, so good," I told him. "That's fine. Really, the old skylight was a sore trial when the weather was rough. We should have a snug winter with this new one." I said I hoped so. "Then the next thing I have here is to fix a date for the Centenary service." He lowered the paper and looked unhappy. "I rather think I shall have to combine it with a Sunday service in December. My diary has suddenly become horribly full for that month. What do you think? I thought perhaps the Sunday before Christmas might be suitable. It would be the last Sunday of term, and we could have prayers and hymns suitable to the occasion at morning service, and my sermon would be on the subject of our heritage here in the village." "It sounds ideal," I said, "and the church would be looking festive too by that stage." "Certainly," said the vicar, looking mightily relieved at my amiability. What did he expect, I wondered, that I might fling myself on the floor, screaming and drumming my heels? The crib would certainly be in place, and no doubt some of the Christmas greenery. Perhaps we could arrange for the children to do some of the decorations, as they do for the harvest festival. "That's a nice idea," I said, but I had private reservations about how the flower ladies would react to juvenile assistants at Christmas time. "Good, good," said Mr. Partridge, making for the door. "I really ought to have a bonfire. I've so much garden stuff to burn, but I intend to wait until dusk. Nothing is going to detract from this beautiful sunshine if I can help it." "Another case of 'gather ye rosebuds as we may,'" I quoted. "Absolutely, Miss Reed, absolutely." He looked at the children with his usual benevolence. "I should take them for a walk this afternoon," he whispered confidentially. "Don't worry," I told him. "It's at the head of the agenda." Chapter 11. November. It was a relief to be without Minnie Pringle's 3 children. Not that they were naughty or rumbustious. In fact, they were just the opposite and sat immobile at their desks, contributing nothing and, as far as one could see, taking in nothing. They were all mouth breathers, which was hardly surprising considering the revolting state of their nasal passages, and no amount of advice, persuasion, or example succeeded in showing them how to blow their noses. They were like their mother in being almost unteachable, but without her demented energy. What they would do when it came to earning a living, I shuddered to think. No doubt an indulgent welfare state would give them far more for doing nothing than they were capable of earning anyway. But if I were relieved to see the back of Minnie's brood, I was really sorry to say farewell to the shepherd's children. Perhaps he had found a better job than his new one with Mr. Roberts? Mr. Willett enlightened me. Been pinchin', not just the odd egg or swede and that. He'd done in one of Mr. Roberts' sheep and sold it to that back street butcher in Caxley. Ought to be deported, the pair of them, but I don't suppose they'll get more than probation when the case comes up. Well, they certainly won't get deported, I assured Mr. Willett. Anyway, who'd want them? We don't, that's for sure. And Mr. Roberts is hoppin' mad. Now he's got to start all over again getting some new chap. Can't trust a soul these days, Miss Reed. They'd take your teeth off the table if you was fool enough to leave 'em there. At the moment, I told him, my teeth, what are left of them, don't take out. Mr. Willett looked sympathetic. Then you've a mortal trouble ahead of you. I'm thankful to say all mine are national gnashers now, and it's a great comfort to take 'em out every now and again and give me gums a nice airin'. He set out across the playground and then turned. Bring the numbers down a bit, though, don't it? Them Pringle kids and the shepherd's lot? Bet you'll be hearing from the office. Oh, shut up, I begged him, for the horrid fact was much in my mind, too. Another cause for relief was the absence of Reg Thorne's men. I had grown quite fond of them both, and found Wayne particularly sensible and friendly. Nevertheless, it was wonderful to be free of that everlasting cacophony from their transistor radio and from the bangs and thumps as they worked overhead. Mr. Willett still looked askance at the finished product, but as I pointed out, no rain had come through now that it was completed, and we certainly seemed to have more light. Hasn't had a fair test yet, Mr. Willett warned me. You wait till that old wind gets up. Unfortunately, we did not have to wait long. The halcyon October weather broke early in November with lashing rain and a high wind. I was relieved to see that no water came through, as it certainly would have done in the old days, but there was an annoying drumming sound as the wind caught the jutting framework. I was not too happy about this vibration and rang Reg Thorne during the dinner hour. For once he was at home. I've got to come over to Springborn this afternoon, he told me. I'll pop in on my way. As one might expect, the wind had dropped considerably by the time he arrived, and the drumming was hardly in evidence. Nevertheless, he clambered up to the window and seemed to make a fairly exhaustive study of the structure. Right as a trivet, he assured me when he descended. Good bit of work, that. You don't need to worry about a thing. Them boys of mine know what they're up to. By the way, have you heard about Ted Richards? I looked blank. Do I know him? Young Wayne's dad. He's had a stroke. The boy's off work for a few days helping out. I'm sorry to hear that. How's the old man getting on? Pretty well. His speech is back, and the doctor says his arm is coming round. Shook the old boy, though. I reckon I'll be losing Wayne. I'll be sorry. He's a good worker, and a bit more on top than some I could mention. Still, his dad comes first, I can see that. He stepped back to take a last satisfied look at his creation, and then departed. I woke in the night to the howling of a terrific gale. I could hear a door banging downstairs and got out of bed to go and shut it. As I did so, a horrific rumbling sounded overhead, and I guessed that a tile had blown loose and was bumping down the roof. The larder door was ajar and banging every time the gusts came through the small window. I closed both and returned through the roaring to my bed. But sleep was impossible. We get these frighteningly strong winds up here on the downs, and a great deal of damage is done to our houses and farm buildings, not to mention trees and gardens. Usually I comfort myself with the thought that I have survived plenty of these rough nights, but this one seemed particularly vicious. One thing, it would test Reg Thorne's new window, I thought. I dropped off again about 6, the storm still raging, so that I overslept and had to hurry around to get over to the school in time. To my dismay, there was rainwater on the floor beneath the window. On looking up, I could see that the whole structure seemed to be slanting, but that the water appeared to be dripping to the right of it. I went outside and bumped into Mr. Willett and pointed out the damage. He surveyed it in silence for a full minute. "It's the roof timbers, I reckon, not so much the window. It's no good patching old with new and expecting 'em both to thrive. Best get old Reg again, I suppose." He came inside with me and surveyed the puddle. Drips from above enlarged it steadily. "Quite like old times, ain't it?" said Mr. Willett, with evident satisfaction. Find out how to cope with a November puddle in the school next time.